Snow. Snow as far as the eye can see under a sky of cold stars. A flat grey road crossing a valley. A fake sun captured in the void. A trail of blood on the steps of the pyramid. The children of the cold, tall and lost, and those of the stars, small and locked up. The endless night and the horizons of light. The twilight of a world, and another, and another, and another, and another. Yawor had stayed alone for 8 nights before the spirits came and talked to him. Inti had chosen him, and he prepared himself to join the sun. On the morning of the 9th day, when the priest came for him, he was calm and ready. The city was celebrating. Everywhere, people were dancing, covered in colorful paints. Flutes, drums, and string instruments roared as Yawor walked up the main street. And people were cheering and singing for him. After an entire week of isolation, the noise of the crowd and the smells made Yawor dizzy, and soon he was waving and smiling at everything, euphoric and light-headed. The priest of Inti took his hand and guided him through the crowd, towards the steps of the Great Pyramid of Tiwanaku. There, a priestess of Pachamama, the motherly goddess of earth, coated his chest with the blood of a young alpaca, so the spirits could accompany him in his journey to come. Then, he followed the priest to the platform, halfway up the stairs, and Yawor knelt as the holy man started speaking, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Inti has spoken," the priest said. "One day, the sun will let itself die and will give up its fight against the moon. And when the day comes, men and women will cry and rejoin their ancestors. But hope will survive. Inti showed us the way. He chose Yawor to save our children to come. 3 times the sun will die, and 3 times the children of Yawor will rekindle the flames of hope and guide us through the night." The crowd erupted into cheers and songs, and the priest guided Yawor to the altar, where he lay down on his back. There, he made a gesture, and the priestess of Pachamama moved towards them, naked and covered in war paints. She started kissing Yawor's legs, and slowly moved up his body until he was hard enough for everyone to see. Then, she climbed up and started riding him. They made love on the altar, and the drums beat faster and faster. Finally, Yawor moaned, and his whole body stiffened before relaxing. The blade in the hand of the priest briefly caught the light of the sun before slicing Yawor's throat. Blood flew all over the priestess' chest, and she roared in delight, her eyes rolling toward the sky. "Yawor's seed is in her," the priest yelled. "Inti will save us. He is now sated, and he will guide our children through the night. They shall see the dawn and the new suns. Let us praise and thank Inti for saving us." Elizabeth had been on the road when she learned the news more than a decade ago. She remembered it just like if it happened yesterday. She was driving on one of those old concrete roads from the last century, still lit by electric lampposts. It had been raining earlier. The asphalt was still glistening, and the sky above the valley was still dark and cloudy. She had hissed when the news broke to her on the screen of her navcom, confirming the fears she had been entertaining for many months now. The sun was dying. Within a few decades, all life on Earth would become impossible. The atmosphere too hostile, the warmth too distant. On that day, the first thing that came to her mind had been the voice of her mother, the chief from one of the last Native American tribes of the country, from when she was still a kid in the reserve, living with her. "The sun will help you and warm you, but it can also stab you in the back. Trust it, and remember that one day it shall be your enemy." And when her mother died, her last words had been, again, a warning against the sun. Maybe it had been because of that Elizabeth decided to pursue such a career. She fought long and hard to complete her scholarship in the most prestigious universities of the continent. And, at the end of her courses, she joined the UNCEC, the United Nations Space Exploration Consortium. When she learned about the sun, After the initial wave of panic and denial, she realized that her entire life guided her to this moment. For years and years she worked in secret with her team, and during all this time the silent weight of knowledge almost crushed them. The knowledge too dangerous to be disclosed to the public. The knowledge that all their effort would just amount to a drop in the ocean. The knowledge that, at best, they would just save a few 100,000 people, and that, at worst, they would simply drift away in space forever, until their descendants would all die, hopeless and frozen. But still, they worked hard, and, as predicted, when the news inevitably broke to the public, panic seized the hearts and minds across the globe. They had to ask for the military to come and protect the construction yard against all those who wanted to bitterly sabotage their effort, or plead for some room board. Every morning and every night she saw them beyond the highly sophisticated fence. The desperate, the angry, the fanatics yelling at the top of their lungs, offering all they had for a ticket aboard, shooting their empty threats at the wind. And Elizabeth had no other choice but to ignore them. Those who would depart had been randomly selected, and she refused to think about the luck she had. She refused to feel what her shrink had called survivor's guilt. After all, she was the chief engineer. Her ticket for the endless wandering looking for a new home was a guarantee for her. But she hated it, and tried to translate her anger and despair into work, determined to give life to the huge metal and ceramic monster of a ship and the artificial sun that would keep them alive for generations. Elizabeth wished she could give an estimate of how long the heart of their fake sun would beat, but it was literally impossible. Too many parameters, too many variables. So she kept on working, designing the instruments and everything else before routing them into orbit, where the ship was slowly growing and taking shape. And she closed her heart to the screams of those they would leave behind. It had been raining lately, and the asphalt still glistened on the morning of the big day. She was the last one to embark aboard the shuttle that would take them up forever, and before the doors closed, she looked up once more at the pale, shy and fragile sun peeking between the clouds. "Thanks for the warmth," she finally whispered. "Rest in peace." Then the door shut behind her, and soon the shuttle was on its way up, towards Intira, the ship that would become her home for the rest of her life, and for the rest of all of their children's lives if they couldn't find a new home. Vallum sighed and leaned over the ramp, frowning. "So?" asked Drill. Vallum shrugged. None of them seemed ready to talk, and only Casra's arrival eventually broke the silence. "Well, I have bad news from the machinery," she said with a heavy tone. "The water purification batteries are down. I've switched them with those from the greenhouse lights, but it is not a very viable solution. We're almost out of lithium and copper, so..." "Which means?" asked Drill. "Which means the plants are gonna die soon," Vallum answered. "And with them our oxygen tanks. We can still hold for a few months with the backup generators, but we need to face it. The Intira is dying." Silence again filled the bridge. Vallum repressed another sigh and gazed sadly at the artificial sun slowly dying above them. The pressure over his shoulders had only kept on growing over the last few years. As the descendant of Elizabeth Sukkanen, the chief engineer who built the ship more than 7 centuries ago, he had responsibilities, as his mother before him, and her father before her. But none of his ancestors had to face what he was facing now. They all knew the Intira would survive them, but not Vallum. He was the last in line. The artificial sun was going weaker and weaker by the day, and they would never be able to fix it. Now, they had 2 choices. Either they would all die frozen, starving and unable to breathe in the vacuum of space, though Vallum suspected they would all kill each other before it came to that. Or they would settle wherever they could, and let chance guide their fate. No matter the warnings passed over the generations, nothing could have prepared him for such a moment. Once again, he wondered if his ancestor, the great and famous Elizabeth Sukkanen, had thought about such a day. But probably not. She very likely thought they would have found a new home by then. But in over 700 years, their paths had not crossed any welcoming world. All the exoplanets analyzed by the radar turned out to be hostile. Either their atmosphere was unbreathable, or filled with viruses and bacteria they were not prepared against, or simply because gravity and distance from their respective stars made them a nightmare to survive on. In any case, the Intera's astrophysicists never deemed a world safe enough for them to settle on. And in the meantime, the generation slowly changed. From 100,000 people when the Intera started its journey, today there were no more than a dozen thousand. Sometimes, browsing the networks, you stumbled upon an old video from the early days, and it was always a heartbreak to see how their ancestors were tall and strong. Nowadays, when someone reached 5 feet, he was considered a very tall person, and the only place you could see an ounce of muscle was in the old commercials piled in the archives. More than 2/3 of the ship had been sacrificed over the centuries in order to save energy, time and space. They left behind them a trail of metal, instruments and ceramic that would probably remain their one and only legacy. All in order to give a few more years to their son, the very son that today was ready to abandon them. Vallum closed his eyes. In the end, they didn't have a choice, and he knew it. "Set a course for IN 596, he finally said, breaking the silence. "We have to. We'll just have to hope we can adapt there." They exchanged a few glances with a heavy heart before nodding. IN 596, nicknamed Nia Inti by the ship's social networks, was the closest exoplanet to their current position, and if everything went alright, they could reach it within a year or so. It would be cold. The air would hurt their throats, and the nights would be long, but it was their only hope. Vallum glanced at the artificial sun one more time, a sad smile on his lips. "Thanks for nothing," he spat. "Thanks for giving up on us, you coward." He grunted and turned away, tears of rage and frustration glowing in his eyes. The sun was finally rising, but it made no difference. Just a dot a tiny bit shinier than the other stars in the vast and dark emptiness of the sky. The sun had never shone with much strength on Neati, but Rhea had seen pictures of the old day, when it was possible to notice the difference between night and day on this frozen world. When their ancestors, led by Vallum Sokanen, her forefather, first landed here on Neati more than 1,000 years ago, they were desperate, exhausted, and on the brink of extinction. But they fought hard, and finally managed to conquer the planet. Or maybe it was the planet that eventually tolerated them. Whatever it was, they survived. They adapted to the ice and snow, and learned to live with the distant sun. But they knew what day was. They had something to give rhythm to their time. For Rhea's generation, the notion of day was just an abstract concept. They only knew night and darkness, and the stars were as cold as their land. She blinked and turned her attention back to the hologram reports gently floating above her desk. She zoomed in on the conclusion of the most recent one inside. The scientists were positive. Neati was drifting further and further away from their distant sun's gravity field. Neatians had learned how to live in the cold. Their body temperature had gone down, their eyes had developed a new membrane to protect them, and the fur on their body had grown thicker over the centuries. And the weak gravity of the planet made them taller, often reaching 8 feet tall. But would all of that help them survive the planet drifting aimlessly in space? Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions had grown more and more frequent over the last few years. The tides had become completely unpredictable, and it would only get worse. Rhea grinded her teeth. Were they ready to leave their homeworld and go back to the emptiness of space? Their ancestors had done it, but the experience left them traumatized. You could still feel it in the culture of today. Mothers told their children tales of the endless wandering across the stars and of the monsters that awaited them there. There had been attempts to create space stations in orbit above Neati, but all of them had been shut down when facing the contempt and fear of the people. The icy stars in their sky had become synonym of death and horror. She had conducted a poll recently. Out of the 9 million people living on Neati, only 2 million said they were ready to fly back to the stars. The rest would remain on Neati until the end, whatever happened. Rhea had tried to lead a sensibilization campaign, to instruct people on the dangers of staying on an icy rock wandering in space, growing colder and wilder every day, arguing that the emptiness of space was not that dangerous, that they knew how to tame it. But her efforts did not meet a lot of success. Some people still heard her. Many politicians, dignitaries and rich fortunes came to her after her declarations. And she received a lot of messages and support from anonymous people all over the planet. But still, it was a minority. She forced a smile on her lips and turned her attention to another report, more hopeful than the previous one this time. The financing for her wild project was going surprisingly strong. Soon, she would gather the necessary sum to start on the construction. Her heart ached a bit when she remembered they would only have room for a few thousand people, and she thought about all those they would leave behind. Even if everybody was ready to come on board, she would never gather enough money to build something that could save the entire planet, even though it was possible in theory. But a feeble hope of survival, even for just a few, was preferable to the slow, cold death awaiting the generations that would desperately and blindly cling to the rock, drifting in the empty oceans of space forever. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then, she walked to the large windows of her office, glancing at the pale dot over there on the horizon. "Thanks for housing us," she sighed, "but we have to go now. Good night, sweet prince." And she turned away, crushed by the weight of the task to come. The priest turned toward his disciples. They were all here, all 19 of them in their heavy robes. Above them, the artificial sun shone its light all over the circular bridge, powering what was left of the Esperati. 1,000 years drifting through the vacuum of space did not do their ship any favor. There were only 46 people still alive on board, and the end was near. Or the end seemed to be near, but the priest knew that if they all listened to him, if they all followed him, a new hope was waiting for them on the horizon. The sun told him so. But more than half of the people aboard called him a crazy fanatic, and yesterday, things almost went to hell. His disciples, tired of the contempt shown to them by the others, had drawn their weapons, and blood had been shed. It could have been even worse if the priest hadn't intervened and promised to calm things down. He knew what he had to do. Once more, he closed his eyes, basked in the light of the sun, and listened to its soothing voice. The sun was singing to him. The voices of his ancestors, those who saved them all, came to him and reassured him, telling him he was on the right path. He opened his eyes and turned back towards his followers. "It is the end," he said, "but the end is always followed by a new beginning. A new life awaits us, a new shiny horizon for all of us. For all of us!" His cold blue eyes came back to the present moment, and he walked toward his disciples, kissing them all as he gave them the pills he made with the energy of the sun, whispering in their ears that they would see each other again very soon. His followers took their pills and slowly went and sat down in circle under the light. Then, the priest walked to the control center and entered the commands he had been working on since the sun first started talking to him. The light of the Esperati shut down, and the ship started falling apart. "Uta, what the fuck are you doing?" yelled the voice from one of the consoles. "Stop that! Stop that now, you fucking dead—" The priest pressed a button, and silence came back. He watched the ship slowly die on the screens, and his smile broadened. Finally, he looked up once more to the sun, and reveled in its splendor and glory, the last light in the endless night. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for the light. Thank you for guiding us through the night, the cold and the void. Thank you." Then he switched off the sun.